Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. This appears to be the weekend of first impressions, so today I'm going to talk about the Anbernic RG557, which just arrived in the mail. And to be honest, I almost sent out a search party for Anbernic because it's been about 4 months since their last official release, and last year they released 12 handhelds, so they really slowed down in 2025. And it also feels like the RG557 is a bit of a half release, because over a year ago they released the RG556, and the only main differences between this handheld and the one from last year is that this one has a new processor as well as some new analog sticks. And so in this video we're going to talk about all the things that you can cover in that first day of owning a handheld, including things like the ergonomics and the buttons and the screen and the audio. We're also going to do some light performance testing to try out this new CPU. So grab your favorite snack and drink and let's see what Anbernic has been cooking. Okay, as always, we're going to start with the specs. So this is running the new Dimensity 8300 chipset. And this is an 8-core CPU with 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. And one of those performance cores is clocked at 3.35 gigahertz. And so this handheld should have a lot more processing power than the Unisoc T820 that was found in the RG556. We've also got 12 gigabytes of LPDDR5X RAM and 256 gigabytes of storage. So those are big bumps from the previous model as well. And it does appear to be using the exact same screen as the last device, so it's about 5.5 inches, 1080p AMOLED 16:9. It's also got the same size battery, 5500 milliamp hours, and it can support up to a 27 watt fast charge. Now, because this is a more modern chipset, that means we have more modern connectivity. So this is running Wi-Fi 6E as well as Bluetooth 5.3. And in terms of operating system, it's running Android 14. Also, according to the spec sheet, this should have USB-C video out, but that will be something that I will put in my final review because I do want to test that pretty thoroughly. Now, in terms of pricing, I'm not sure because it hasn't been announced yet, but I've heard everything from like $200 to $250 plus shipping and tariffs and everything else. And so that's what I'm expecting in terms of price point, but I'm going to wait until that finally gets announced before I make my actual review. Now, the units that I'm going to be testing here today were sent over by Anbernic, but like with all of my videos, all opinions are my own, no money was exchanged in any way, and they're not going to be seeing this video ahead of time. Now, before we actually take this thing apart, I wanted to show off this ridiculous case that they sent over. I'm calling this thing a carbon fiber Ronald McDonald. Now, I have no idea what motivated them to make this case, but I find it really amusing, so I'm actually pretty happy with it, and it fits the device perfectly. You know, it's made specifically for this handheld, and so yeah, I think that if they price this right, you know, maybe around $10 or something, it might be well worth it. It's actually really funny just from a novelty perspective. Now, we've got 2 different color options for the RG557. There's the transparent purple as well as the white. I'm going to open up the white one, but I have been messing around with the transparent purple, so we'll take a look at both. Now, inside the box, you will find, you know, obviously the handheld itself, but then also a USB-C to USB-A charging cable, then also a screen protector and some wipes, and then also a quick start guide. We'll go over most of the software stuff in this video. But looking at the handheld itself, you can see that, yeah, the white model is actually pretty sleek. They have, you know, a little bit of light coloring here on the buttons, but otherwise it's pretty clean looking. The plastic texture here is also pretty good. It's got a little bit of grit to it, but I would say it's more on the smooth side than matte. Now, the transparent model has a different look and feel to it. It actually uses a very transparent plastic, so you can see all the way inside the handheld. It's not matte or covered in any way. In fact, the plastic texture here is super sleek and kind of glassy. You can see that it's also very fingerprinty. It's got my fingerprints all over it just from messing around with it over the past few hours. But I really do like this transparent look and the fact that I can, you know, see the internals of the device. And, you know, the PCB itself actually looks very nice. It's got this purple kind of tinge to it, but then the gold accents within the PCB make it look just kind of classic, like 70s almost. And so I like the look of it, especially on the right side. The left side doesn't have as much gold to it, so it's not quite as pretty, but I do like the fact that this is transparent, but I don't really like the way it feels just because it is so slick and glossy. Now, the previous RG556s also had different colors. There was a black model and then there was a transparent blue one. It was like this, but just a little bit lighter. And I was torn between those two as well because I like the feel of the matte one and then I also like the look of the glossy one. And I'm kind of getting those same vibes right now. I'm not really sure which one I'm actually going to be using more often than the other. And here's a look at the transparent RG556 versus the RG557. So yeah, this one used to be blue, but you can also see they've made some major improvements in the RGB lights. This one is only white, and you can see that, you know, the entire rim is super visible. So I never really liked the LEDs on this one, but these actually look pretty good. You know, they're actually circular, and you can change the colors on them. Now, the Anbernic RG557 is what I would consider a mid-sized handheld, something that is going to be great for both emulation as well as game streaming. So you might be curious on how that size compares to other handhelds within a similar price range. I think its main competitor is going to be the Retroid Pocket 5. This one also has a 5.5-inch display that is AMOLED as well. And you can see that the Retroid is a lot more compact of a handheld, whereas the Anbernic is mostly leaning towards ergonomics. Here's a look at the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, also 5.5-inch screen, but with a clamshell form factor. One other handheld with a 5.5-inch display is going to be the Nintendo Switch Lite, and you can see that this one is also smaller than the RG557. Now, moving up to larger displays, here's the Odin 2, which has a 6-inch panel that is LCD. This one, I would say, as a whole, is a little bit larger than the 557. Going up from there, our first 7-inch device is going to be the Nintendo Switch OLED, and you can see that this one is quite a bit bigger than the 557. And then finally, one more 7-inch display device is the Odin 2 Portal. This guy is pretty darn big, both in terms of screen and just overall size. And of course, who could forget our little buddy, the Steam Deck OLED? You can see this one is just massive compared to the RG557, which is not a small device in the first place. So in general, I would say that yeah, the RG557 is a decently sized handheld. It is quite ergonomic and comfortable because we have these protruding grips right here. And so it is a pleasure to hold altogether, and it is a bit smaller in terms of screen size compared to some bigger options, but it is a very comfortable and somewhat large device altogether. All right, let's talk about these controls. We're going to start with the analog sticks because these are brand new on this handheld. In fact, I've never seen these sticks before. The company is calling these high-resolution anti-magnetic interference capacitive joysticks, and that's a mouthful. My guess is that these are TMR joysticks, which are kind of the rage right now in the controller world, and it makes sense because they had perfectly good Hall sensor sticks that came out late last year, and so it looks like they tried to upgrade with TMR joysticks instead. And the thing about TMR joysticks, if these are indeed TMR joysticks, is that they use a very low power profile, so they help with saving on battery life, but they also have very accurate input. However, regardless of whatever technology they're using, I'm not really a fan of these sticks. I don't think that they stick out far enough, especially for a device that's kind of made for ergonomics and game streaming, and then also they do not have a wide range of motion. They kind of feel like these sticks on a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con, so it kind of feels like a step backwards. The last major launch from Anbernic was this guy. This is the RG406H, so it has the same chipset as the RG556, and this one had upgraded sticks. These are Hall sensor sticks, and you can see they have a huge range of motion. Now the sticks themselves do stick out quite a bit, and that does make it less pocketable, but it had a huge range of motion and very accurate input. And so I personally would have preferred to have a stick like this. One of my favorite aspects of these sticks is that the caps actually came right off. And so you could get other caps for it, like wider caps or taller caps or even low profile caps. And so it allowed us to kind of mod the device to meet our needs. And so I personally was expecting to see these sticks again on the RG557 because I think they are a huge upgrade over the 556. But instead we got these little tiny sticks right here, which are almost comically small, and unfortunately the caps do not pull off either. And so the only modding that we can do for these is just to add a cap on top of them, which is not going to improve the range of motion. And so I'm pretty unhappy with these sticks altogether. And it is really strange that they had perfectly good sticks on their previous model and then kind of took a step backwards with these ones. I understand that, yeah, maybe they have better technology in them, but I would have been just fine with the Hall sensor ones instead. And for a device that's so hefty in the hands, these sticks just feel comically small, like they are not a good match for the overall control scheme. I did try some game streaming with them and it worked fine, like I was able to make all the movements that I wanted to, but it just wasn't a pleasure to play, which is what I was expecting if they had used those Hall sensor sticks. And so I'm not really sure what's going on here, but yeah, I'm not a fan of these sticks yet again on this model. Now, the one silver lining to these sticks is that they actually do work out pretty well. We've got a full range of motion here, no cardinal snapping. You know, all the issues we've seen with previous Anbernic joysticks, we're not seeing it here. So the overall controls themselves in terms of accuracy and overall feel, they are pretty good, and they are better than the RG556. I just think they are a little bit small and awkward. Now these joysticks also have RGB light options, so you can adjust that by going into the Android settings by swiping down and over. So here there are a bunch of different profiles you can choose from, but then also if you long press on it, it'll bring up a full menu. So here you can adjust things like the brightness and the colors and the speed as well. But overall, I'm not a fan of these joysticks on this particular handheld. I think they will work out well with smaller handhelds, but for something big like this, I would prioritize comfort over pocketability. And unfortunately, I think that these are just too small. Now let's talk about the D-pad, which I think is both good and bad. So it has a rubber membrane connection, so it's got that kind of mushy classic feel to it, like an older controller, but it doesn't feel like one, and that's because it has a glossy texture to it. Most of the older ones are going to be like matte textured and have a little bit of texture to them, like indentations in the D-pad, but this is just straight and glossy. So it is a bit of a weird feeling if you ask me. It's got some good pivot to it, but yeah, it just doesn't feel very natural in terms of just a classic design. Now, the two main D-pad tests I'd like to do include the contra test. This is where I press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And ideally, if I just rock it a little bit, the character will not move, but if I push it as far as I can, usually the character will move, and that's the sign of a good D-pad. The idea here is I don't want accidental diagonals, and this is mostly lining up to my expectations, but I will say it's a bit more sensitive than I would like. By that, I mean it doesn't take a lot of force to rock it in one direction or the other, and the character will move. So it's a little bit of a touchy D-pad, but overall I would say it barely passes the contra test. Now on the other side of the coin, I also like to test games that really require a diagonal input, like a Street Fighter fighting game. And here I'm having absolutely no problem pulling off these moves. Now, I grew up playing with a rubber membrane D-pad like a Super Nintendo controller and learning these games, so this is very natural for me, and yes, it feels good. It is a little bit strange that the D-pad is glossy, but overall I can control it just fine. So I would say this D-pad is definitely Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. And so in the end, I'm not a huge fan of the D-pad, but I think it is functional, so no major complaints other than the fact that it feels a little bit weird. Now also on the right side, we've got our face buttons, and these are rubber membranes, so they have a classic sort of feel to them, and yeah, they feel very good. They are also very quiet. You know, a lot of the more recent handhelds I've been testing have been somewhat clacky in their shell, but thankfully this one is just kind of mushy and quiet. And by mushy, I don't mean that it feels bad, because it still has a tactile nature to it, but I just mean that it doesn't clack around. So I think overall these will be excellent buttons to play next to like your significant other at night, because it's not going to wake them up. Now on the front, we also have some function buttons. So we have select and start on the right side, and then we have a back and home button. So if we tap on this, it'll go back. If we press and hold it, it will go home. Then also we have like this RG button right here. This brings up the Anbernic front end. This will require more testing because I want to check out the front end and do a deep dive on it. And they also sent over one of their micro SD cards that are preloaded with games. So this will be an option when you pick it up to buy a larger SD card, and it's supposed to just work with their launcher out of the box. And so I want to review that experience in my final review video. Up top, we have our shoulder and trigger buttons. Let's talk about these next. So the shoulder buttons are just a micro switch, kind of clicky shoulder button. They're a little bit loud. They're probably the loudest buttons on the device, but I wouldn't necessarily say that they are too loud or anything. They're just kind of clicky. Thankfully, they are easy to press down on, and you can kind of press them anywhere on the button, which means that no matter how you're holding it, it should be fine. Now the triggers are analog, which means that you have a range of input here from 0 to 100. So if you're playing like a racing game, like streaming, you will be able to press on the gas in different increments. There's not a ton of travel to it, so it's not very nuanced, but you at least have that input for other things as well, including like GameCube. My only gripe about these inputs is that they are a little bit more resistant than I would like. Like, it takes a lot of force to actually push them down. This was a lot like how it was in the RG556. Also up top, we've got our power button, which will function as a sleep button in Android, and then our volume up and down, and then an LED that will go red when you charge it. And we've also got an exhaust vent because this device does have active cooling, so it'll come in through here, go through the device, and cool off the chip, which is around here, and then it will go and exhaust out the top. On the bottom, we've got a 3.5mm headphone jack, our USB-C port for charging and video out, and then we have a little flap right here for our micro SD card. And then finally, we also have our speakers, which are downward firing. Let's do a quick audio test here with Horizon Chase at 100% volume. So number one, this definitely does get loud, but I think that the sound profile overall is a bit muffled. Like, I can hear a little bit of the high end and some of that bass as well, but it's really the mid-range, which is just kind of washing everything else out. And so I would say this sound profile is not the best, but it is nice and loud. And I think that for a device that costs over $200, we should expect a little bit better audio than we're seeing here. Part of that has to do with the fact that it is downward firing, and so it's not going to be just directly into your ears, but yeah, I think that this audio profile could be better. Okay, now let's take a look at the screen, and it does appear to be almost identical to the one on the RG556. It has the exact same specs, but I did see that the color profile between the two was a little bit better on the RG557. I always felt like the RG556 just had a little bit more of a cool color balance. But you can see that there is a temperature difference between the two. The Horizon Chase logo is a lot cooler on the RG556 compared to the RG557. In addition, the car just looks a little bit more red, so I think it is skewed more towards being a warm profile. Now that being said, it's still a cool image altogether. If we compare it to the Retroid Pocket 5, which I think is just about perfect in terms of color balance, you can see that the Retroid Pocket 5 is even warmer. It's a lot more apparent when we look at something with a white background like here with Dolphin. You can see that the white in the Retroid Pocket 5 is somewhat neutral, but on the RG557, it still has a little bit of a bluish hue to it. In the end, I do think that the screen is an improvement over the RG556 units that I had previously, just in the fact that the color balance looks a little bit more natural. Now, one thing you might notice with this screen is we're getting this banding along the side, and this is called PWM, or Pulse Width Modulation Flickering. Now, to the naked eye, you will not see this. It all has to do with these settings on my camera and its shutter speed, and I'm running it at 30 frames per second because that's a good number to work with when it comes to game testing. So to the naked eye, it should look just fine, but there are people who are sensitive to PWM flickering, and I would say that this has some pretty bad flickering, all things considered. So if you are sensitive to it, like you get headaches from looking at OLED displays like this, then this is not going to help you in that regard. Other devices like the Retroid Pocket 5 have much lower amounts of flickering, so that's what I would recommend checking out if you are one of those people who are sensitive to this. Now, one of the great things about an OLED display is that they can get very bright. So here I am at 100% brightness, and you can see that, yeah, it's washing everything out because my camera is not used to something so bright. So that is a very good sign. I also took the device outdoors and just tested it against daylight. Now, it was later in the afternoon, so the sun wasn't quite as bright, but you can see that it's still very visible. Even when angling it towards, like clouds in the sky itself, I can still see this. And so this might be a device that you could play outdoors if you would like. I have definitely seen brighter devices, including the Retroid Pocket 5, but this is still pretty darn good. Now at 0% brightness, you can see it is very dim, and I think if you combine that with the very quiet buttons, this might be a really excellent late night device just because it's not going to be super loud and then also will not be very bright either. And so if you are going to be playing it in a very dimly lit scenario, for example, like in a pitch black environment, then yes, this will be a good nighttime handheld. But for the most part, I've just been using it around 45 or 50% brightness, and this has been just fine in an indoor environment. So that's what I would recommend just as kind of your standard. Okay, now let's talk about the software experience. And first thing you will notice is that it's preloaded with a bunch of apps. And I have to bring this up every time I see an Anbernic build like this, because a lot of these apps are actually paid apps. All these that say .emu are like $5 each on the Google Play Store. So they've cracked these and then added them to their firmware build, and I don't really like that. Same thing with like Mupin and Yabasan Shiro. Those are also paid apps that they just have preloaded on here. And so not a big fan of that whole setup. Another app that they've added here is called Rixel HK. I'm not a fan of this one either. This is essentially just a free ROM store. So somebody just put, a repository of games on there and you can just go and download them directly. And it's kind of shady. Like this whole setup here is not above board and something that really is only Anbernic that does this, and I don't like this build. A lot of the other big players in the scene, Retroid and AYN, they just provide you a clean interface, and so you download all of your games, or they will have some pre-installed ones that you can choose to install, but they're all the free versions as well. And I suspect the reason why they have all these apps and configurations and whatnot is because they want to use it with their RG launcher. So they want you to buy an SD card with all the games loaded onto it, and then it'll all be preloaded and pre-configured. And I get the idea of having it very easy to use, but it is also super sketchy. And I'm not saying this to get on a soapbox about whether or not you should be using these emulators or paying for them or anything else like that, but rather that this just endangers the entire emulation scene because this is stolen content. And so with all the Anbernic Android devices, my recommendation is always just to uninstall all of these apps and then load up all of your own so you have a cleaner interface and you also can configure it yourself using some of those guides I have on my channel. At the very least, the device does have Google Play Store so you can access your games and emulators from there. And that's really about it when it comes to the Android build. There are a couple other things that you can see up here at the top. So you have the ability to use a key mapper. So if you're playing an Android game and you want to map the touch controls to a button, you can do that within there. The software itself is not great, but you at least have the option. They've also got this toggle between auto mode and high mode. And I'll tell you, there is no performance difference between the two. It makes it look like, put it in high mode, you're going to get better performance. But I found that my benchmarks do worse when I turn this one on. So I generally just leave this one off. You can also change your fan speed. So they have an auto setting as well as cool and strong. I just leave mine on auto and it'll kick in when it needs to. It actually does a pretty good job of knowing when to cool down. Now on the next screen, we have the ability to change out our button functions. By default, it's going to be a Nintendo Switch mode, but then have analog triggers. What you can do instead is you can just tap on the Xbox mode, and then you can set it for both the buttons as well as the triggers. That means the ABXY will put A down on the bottom. And I do want to give some props to Anbernic with their Android build because with this one, they finally fixed a bug. Previously, if you set this to Xbox mode, but then restarted your device, it would automatically go back to Nintendo Switch mode. But thankfully, it doesn't. It actually persists through a reboot. So that's nice to see. And the reason why I recommend the Xbox one is because if you're going to be using it with game streaming, that's the layout that you're going to want to follow. So really, when looking at this Android build, I have seen things that are just the same. The fact that we don't really have a CPU toggle here, it's just kind of a placebo effect, and then some things that are better. For example, this now persists through a reboot. However, after messing around with the transparent purple one for a couple hours, I've already seen some cracks in their software. For example, under Emulation Station Desktop Edition, if we go into the app info, it actually will not grant any sort of permissions. So you can see here, no permissions are granted. If I try to click on it, there is nothing that I can do here to actually give it permissions to access the internal storage. And what this means is that certain things within Emulation Station Desktop Edition, which is my favorite front end, cannot actually be saved. And one of those, most importantly, are themes. So if we go into UI settings and then theme downloader, it'll go down and actually start to download the theme list. But once it completes, it'll say that there's an error. And that's because it is not able to write anything to the internal storage. And so what this means is that you are going to be stuck with the default theme in Emulation Station with this device unless you find a workaround. For example, you can transfer over some files into the internal storage and put them in the correct folder, and that will basically force the theme to work, but you're not going to be able to download it yourself, which is a real bummer. Now, you will be able to scrape your media and stuff like that if you store that on an SD card, but if you try to put anything internally, it's going to run into problems, and that's unfortunate, and it's a permissions error. And if I was able to find that in just the first hour or two of testing with the software, that means that there are probably going to be other bugs with this software as well. Anbernic's Android build has always been a little bit sketchy, but this one seems particularly bad. And again, when we're talking about a device that costs over $200, I think that we should expect to have good software with it as well. And unfortunately, Android's not one of those things where you can just plop on new custom firmware. Instead, we might be stuck with this Android build, which is a real bummer. So I'll do a lot more testing before my final review. It takes some time just because some of these are kind of hidden bugs that you have to figure out over time. So give me a little bit of time to test it and whatnot, but I will say I'm not very confident in this Android build compared to other devices at the same price point. Okay, next let's talk about performance testing. Now, this is going to take a long time to test as well, especially because this is a brand new chipset, but I did do just a few tests to give me an idea of what to expect with the Dimensity 8300. So let's start with some benchmarks, and I tested it against the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 found in the Odin 2. So this is a more expensive device, it's about $300 plus, but it is one of the best performing Android handhelds that we have today. In addition, I tested it against the Retroid Pocket 5, which has the Snapdragon 865. That's an older chipset, but it does a really good job when it comes to emulation. A lot of that has to do with the fact that it is a former flagship chip. Now for this test, I had to use Wildlife Extreme because the regular Wildlife is not hard enough of a test for the Odin 2. It maxes out every time. So instead, we went with one that is a lot harder to run. And I was surprised to find that the RG557 actually got very close to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 in terms of just pure numbers. In fact, the GPU performance here is twice as good as the Retroid Pocket 5, and that is really impressive considering that these are probably going to be around the same price point. Now moving over to a CPU-related benchmark, I did see that this was still better than the Retroid Pocket 5, but not by that much. When it comes to single-core performance, you can see it's only a couple hundred above the Retroid Pocket 5, and single-core performance is really important when it comes to emulation. Meanwhile, the Odin 2 did perform better than the others, but not by a huge margin like it was with the GPU benchmark. Now, when it comes to emulation testing, I just stuck with a couple of the more mainstream systems, those that I think most people will probably try to play with this device, and then, a smattering of games to see what I could expect. So here with Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3, yeah, this is running at full speed no problem at a 3x resolution. So this performance is already better than the RG556, and it gives me a good indication that most GameCube games are going to play at full speed, even with a 3x upscale. Another good example is F-Zero GX, so this is at a 3x resolution with the Vulkan backend, and yeah, it's running at full speed as well. Now this is not the most demanding track in the game, but the fact that this is really hovering around 60 frames per second the entire time is a really good sign. And then finally, looking at Rogue Squadron 2, probably the hardest game to play on GameCube. This one is not playing at full speed at a 2x resolution, so I did dip it down a little bit, and it's still not running fully. It is very close to being at full speed, but not quite there, and so I think that big fans of this game will probably not find this playable. So it does go to show that GameCube is not going to be infallible. There will be some games that have problems just from pure power performance. And it's also worth noting that I was seeing some compatibility issues as well. For example, here with Super Mario Sunburn. This is a game that is a mod of Super Mario Sunshine, and on the Retroid Pocket 5, I can run this at a 2x resolution with a 60 frames per second mod on the game itself, and it runs just great. But unfortunately here with the RG557 with a 2x resolution upscale and running at 30 frames per second, it was not running at full speed. It was hovering around 27, 28. And so this was kind of alarming to me. The fact that this device should have better CPU performance and twice the GPU performance of the Retroid Pocket 5 was still running worse than the Snapdragon 865 found in that model. And so this does lead me to think that yes, the Dimensity chip found in the RG557 is going to have compatibility issues compared to a Snapdragon chipset. And this is a very common thing found with the Mali drivers in the Dimensity chipset. So I'm not super surprised, but I am disappointed that we have all this raw power and it actually isn't going to amount to much with certain games. Now moving on to PlayStation 2, I found that many games played very well. A good example is Ratchet & Clank. This one is running at a 2.5x resolution upscale, and yeah, it's actually running great. And this is a game I would consider to be mid to somewhat high tier in terms of emulation power requirement. And so this means that many games on the PlayStation 2 are going to play great even at a 2.5x resolution, which is an excellent fit for a 1080p resolution display. However, with other games like Soul Calibur 3, I did find this one had quite a few dips, and the really important thing here is that when it would dip down, which happens pretty often with this game, it was to the point where I felt it as well. So it wasn't just a stutter in the metrics themselves, but in the gameplay, like I could hear some audio crackling and slowdown, and that's always a bad experience when it comes to emulation. To give you another idea, the Retroid Pocket 5 also has a little bit of slowdown at this same resolution when playing Soul Calibur 3. However, when it does make those dips, it isn't as prominent because the gameplay itself doesn't slow down as much, and so I would still rather play this game on the Retroid Pocket 5. Here's one more example with God of War 2. This is a game that Anbernic themselves showed off in one of their videos, but of course they didn't put any of the metrics up above, so we have no idea what resolution they were using, as well as, the actual speed of the gameplay. And so here I am at a 2.5x resolution with the Vulkan backend, and you can see that yes, we're getting quite a bit of slowdown here and there. And the experience is a lot like Soul Calibur 3, that when it dips, you can feel that dip. And so that takes away from the entire emulation experience. So at this point, you would have to do things like downscale the resolution to maybe a 2x or a 1.5x, or you would have to use things like underclocking to try to gimmick the machine to actually play at full speed. Regardless, I was hoping that the RG557 would be a plug-and-play device when it came to GameCube and PS2. After all, the RG556 was on the cusp of really playing all those systems great. But here I am finding that I am getting problems just in the first few minutes of testing, which is never a good sign. To give you another example, let's go back to the Retroid Pocket 5, again at a 2.5x resolution, and this one is getting a little bit of slowdown here and there, but definitely not to the point of being comparable to the RG557. In other words, I would play God of War with these settings on the Retroid Pocket 5, but I would not on the RG557. Now bear in mind there are other things I need to test. For example, there are 2 different versions of this PS2 emulator app, and so one might work better on this than the other. So don't take this as definitive proof that PS2 is lousy on this device or anything, it just means that it's not going to be plug and play. Now for some of the higher end systems, this is where that Mali GPU really comes into play because I found so many problems. I will talk about this more in the final review, but for Wii U games, for example, Wind Waker HD, I was not even able to play this game at all because it just gave me a red screen. And again, it makes sense because most of these high-end emulators prioritize using Snapdragon chipsets because that's what you can find in most flagship phones. I had similar problems with Nintendo Switch emulation, which again I'll talk about in my final review, but I would say that just based on compatibility, I would not get your hopes too high for Wii U and Nintendo Switch. And then finally, like I mentioned before, I did some game streaming testing. Not a ton of it, but I at least tested with the Xbox app to make sure that all the buttons and inputs were working correctly, and they were. This again is something that I also want to test further in my final review to see, what the decoding time is going to be with this chipset and how good of an experience it will be overall. But I will say, at least from a functional standpoint, yes, this is working great, and the ergonomics are really excellent as well. Those analog sticks, they're still super small and kind of bother me, but this is a device that I would say is going to work pretty well for game streaming other than those analog sticks. Okay, we've been diving in a lot into the details, even though this is a first impressions video. So let's kind of wrap up and talk about some of the things that I found that are very good about this device and some of the things that are less good. On the good column, I have three main things here. Number one are the ergonomics. This is a very comfortable handheld. I like the fact that we have those flared grips. It just feels really good to hold in the hands. I also like this AMOLED display. It's not the best one out there compared to similar handhelds, but I like the fact that it's OLED and vibrant and very bright. It also does appear that they have improved the color balance as well, so that it does feel a little bit more natural. And then finally, I do like that they are trying to use a powerful CPU on this handheld. In terms of raw performance, if this price is going to be $250 or less, this will be one of the more powerful handhelds at that price point. But that also leads into some of the things we're going to talk about next in our other section, which is less good. Let's start with these analog sticks, which I think are just too small. And it's a real big bummer that you're not actually able to pull these sticks out and then add in something else like you can on other handhelds. Instead, we are stuck with small joysticks that are smaller than their previous handheld, which was a smaller handheld than the RG557. I also think that the audio quality was not the best. It sounded overall muffled. Part of that has to do with the fact that they are downward firing speakers, but just overall, they don't sound that great. Thankfully, the device does get very loud, but it doesn't sound very pleasant to me. I'm also not a huge fan of the Android build that Anbernic uses. They've preloaded with a bunch of paid apps, which is shady on its own, but then also the Android build has just got a few hiccups to it. For example, I'm not able to use certain apps to write to the internal storage, which cripples those apps. And so it is really unfortunate that some fundamental aspects of an Android build just really aren't up to par when it comes to this Anbernic handheld. And then finally, my biggest hesitation here comes from the Mali drivers found on this MediaTek chipset. And Mali drivers are notorious in the Android emulation world for just not being very good compared to their Snapdragon counterparts. For example, some handheld devices like the Odin 2 and Retroid Pocket 5, they use Snapdragon chipsets, which allow them to use turnip drivers, which are third-party drivers that can be loaded into high-end emulators like the Nintendo Switch emulators, which will improve performance and compatibility. And unfortunately, because we're using a Dimensity chipset on the RG557, we don't have access to any of that work done by the community. Instead, we're basically stuck with the drivers that were provided by the manufacturer, which are very rarely updated. And what this means is that we will likely find compatibility issues with emulators like I've already found in my initial testing, and they may not get improved over time. Okay, so as you've already figured out from the last section, I'm not super impressed with the RG557 in my initial impressions. And, they took 4 months off between their last device and this one here, and so I figured that they were really cooking. Like, they were sitting back at headquarters and thinking about how can we appeal to our user base, like working from the ground up. Let's revolutionize our company and take 4 months to do it. And instead, we just got kind of a half-assed refresh of the RG556. Yes, it has a more powerful CPU inside of it. Yes, it has new analog sticks, and they don't have cardinal snapping. But that CPU that they've chosen to use has a Mali GPU, which means that compatibility is going to be a problem with a lot of the high-end emulators, which is probably what you're going to want a high-end chip for. In addition, the analog sticks that they used on this device are actually worse than the RG406H, their last major release. They are smaller, and also you're not able to take them off and improve them on your own. And so I'm a little bit disappointed in this overall experience. I thought that we were going to have some sort of revolutionary thing happening within the Anbernic space, but I'm not seeing it, at least right now. So in the end, just based on these first impressions, I would say hold off on making any of these pre-orders until we can get more testing, both from me and other reviewers and the community itself, because I feel like there's going to be software bugs and other things that I haven't found just yet. And I think my experience with the RG557 is going to mirror a lot of other people's, because I enjoyed the RG556. In fact, I thought it was one of the best devices that the company had released, with some obvious flaws to it. And it's crazy that over a year later, they finally make a refresh, and a lot of these updates are very trivial. And for every improvement I've found on this handheld, I feel like I've found other steps backward as well. Anyway, that's it for now. I don't want to drag this out too much, but be on the lookout for that final review. It's going to take a couple weeks just because there's a lot of testing that needs to happen, and this thing isn't even up for pre-order or anything just yet. So be on the lookout for that, but let me know what you think in the comments down below. I will say that, just in using this over the past few hours, that I kind of like it less than I did when I saw it on paper and had kind of hopes that it would be a true successor to the RG556. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.